Or not.
All right. Looks like we are good to go. I believe we are live streaming. Yes, we are live. So let me record and we'll get rocking. All right. Here we go. And record. Welcome back to Beyond Sunday School. Glad to have you with us this week. We are continuing in our conversation about what's up with resurrection. We are doing a deep dive into the resurrection of the Son of God, resurrection of Jesus. So this week we are going to be spending some time looking at the Old Testament, and we are using a text called The New Testament in Its World by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. And so if you ever want to grab a pretty good New Testament survey, you can do so right there. And it's very helpful, very in-depth, really hits on a lot of the latest scholarship and latest questions, and definitely worth the time, energy, and money to have on your shelf if you want to go deep on some of these things. And so today you may hear some voices in our stream, and those are my friends that are live with me in the Zoom room. If you would like to be a part of the live recording of Beyond Sunday School, you can do so by joining us in the Zoom room on Thursdays at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. Just reach out to me anywhere that you can find me on any social network, and just send me a message, and I'll hook you up with the invitation to join us here live. If you're with us live, you can interrupt me and ask questions. Otherwise, if you're watching this live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, anywhere that it's going out, feel free to drop a comment on the video. And at the end of our session together, I will look at those questions, and if you guys have questions, we'll seek to answer them. So I think that's all of the important information. You can always listen back to this on as a podcast, audio only. Just look up Beyond Sunday School anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also rewatch all of this on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. It's there for you to watch. So again, thanks for being with us, and we are going to dive on in here. Looking at the resurrection. So last week we spent some time looking at the kind of secular concepts of life after death, in that right around the time of Christ, in that first century prior to. So really trying to look at the secular culture, trying to get a sense of the Greek and Roman ideas about what happens when you died, because that helps us understand what some of the cultural milieu might have been when the gospel writers were writing, when Paul was writing, when the New Testament writers were all writing. And really what the conclusion that we come to at the end of that, if you were to look back at that, is that there aren't a lot of parallels between the Greek and Roman understandings of life after death and the Christian idea of resurrection. So that kind of leaves us with the question then, where did they come up with this? Was it grounded anywhere in their cultural landscape, or was this a completely new idea that Christians simply invented? Well, it turns out that this idea of resurrection is rooted somewhere, and it was rooted in the Jewish mindset, in the Jewish culture, in the Jewish religious landscape. Now, it's not rooted in the way that maybe we would think it was, or maybe not quite as straightforward as we think it should be or would be. But it's there, and I think once we begin to wrap our minds around it, we will be pretty surprised at how deep that rabbit hole goes. So this week we are going to look at kind of the Jewish perspective from the Old Testament. Next week, we are going to look at the Jewish perspective in the kind of Second Temple period, the post-biblical material that's out there. We could have done it all in 1 week, but it felt a little overwhelming. It felt like there was a lot there, and so I'm splitting it up into two. So it might be two shorter weeks. We'll see. But we're going to spend a lot of time in the scriptures today. We're going to be all over the place. So grab a Bible and let's get rolling. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to get hopping here. So what's up with resurrection beyond Sunday school? So why do we want to look at the Old Testament? Well, we want to look at the Old Testament because it provides context for the New Testament writings. And that in and of itself is pretty important. That's almost enough right there. We almost don't even need any more of a reason to keep looking at this. But this is fundamental. The New Testament writings didn't come out of thin air. They weren't just kind of invented by the New Testament authors. They were deeply rooted in the Old Testament. This is why you see throughout the Gospels, as it is written, it fulfilled this, it fulfilled that prophecy, that writing. Paul talks about as in the scriptures, right? You see that phrase throughout the New Testament. And when it's talking about that, it's talking about the Old Testament, because the Old Testament were the New Testament writers' scriptures. And so if we want to understand them, if we want to try to grab hold of what was going through their mind, trying to understand the perspective that they were coming from, then we need to try to come to terms with and try to come to grips with what the Old Testament has to say on this particular issue. The Old Testament provides context for the Jewish leaders' response to Paul. When you read through the book of Acts, for instance, the Jewish leaders were not they were not big fans of Paul, especially when he starts talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And so this provides us some context there as well. And then we've already touched on this, but the pagan world at the time does not provide a context for resurrection. And so for us to try to understand where this comes from, if it's not coming from the pagan world, then could it possibly have come out of the Old Testament? The Old Testament also provides the scriptural grounding for the resurrection. So this is here to show us, to help us understand that, again, that the New Testament writers were not unmoored from the scriptures. They were not inventing something new. They were developing this idea that was already present, that was already a part of their faith tradition. They're just developing it. They're just taking it to the next step. It's what we might call an unfolding of progressive revelation. How's that for some 25-cent words? So we understand that what happens in the scriptures is something called progressive revelation, where God is constantly revealing himself more. He is constantly showing us, teaching us more of who he is when the time is right, when the time is appropriate. And so things that weren't quite ready, weren't fully baked back in Genesis chapter 1, for instance, become more fully baked in Genesis 50 and in Deuteronomy, and then in the Kings, and then through the prophets, and then ultimately through the person, life, and work of Jesus, who is the ultimate revelation of the divine. So we need to try to understand what was this Old Testament scriptural grounding. Now, let's really get after it. The afterlife, and this may be surprising. This might make you a little bit uncomfortable almost. But the afterlife and hopes of the afterlife were not central issues in the Old Testament. They just weren't. This was not This was not kind of the end all be all issue like it is in modern day Christianity, right? I mean, you hear a gospel presentation in modern day Christianity, you would think Christianity cared nothing about life today. That the only worry was life in the future, what happens after you die, and in the Old Testament, there was much more concern about right here, right now, very much real life concerns with the promised land, concerns with the monarchy, concerns with the temple. This was these were the issues that were at play, very much right here, right now kind of ideas. As you read through, in the vast majority of the Old Testament, what you see is that the dead went to Sheol, the pit, the grave, the dark. And all those terms really, for the most part, are interchangeable. We see them in similar contexts throughout the Old Testament. We see them being developed, and it almost has a similar understanding that is Homer, right? That we talked about last week. This idea of people kind of being shades or phantoms, it kind of just a hopeless, miserable experience in a sense. Not that they're necessarily under judgment. They just weren't anything. It was just they were just dead. They were in the darkness. They were asleep. It was kind of awful. There wasn't much hope. And this is what we see in a lot of the Old Testament scriptures. So you can look at some of these things like Genesis 3:19 or Psalms 30 verse 9, Psalm 88 3 through 10, Isaiah 38 10 through 18, 2 Samuel 14:14, Ecclesiastes 9:5 through 6:10, Job 3:13 through 19. Now, if we were to turn and look at all of these passages together and walk through each of these, we'd be here for hours. And so I would encourage you to look those up. If you're listening to this audio only, you may want to pause it here, or potentially just go pop over to YouTube or something along those lines, and you can see this on the slide in the PowerPoint deck here, and we can where you can catch these verses on your own time. But this is kind of general understanding. Psalm 6:5 says this: "Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave?" You see, in the Old Testament, there was this sense that once you died, your voice was gone. There was no praising God. God's presence was gone from you. You were just simply dead. It is not the dead who praise the Lord, those who go down to the place of silence. Psalm 115:17. Again, the dead in much of the Old Testament understanding were unable to do anything, and because they were simply dead. So if you were to kind of paint this generalized picture of the Old Testament, it would be that when you're dead, and there is nothing else after. And now that's uncomfortable for us. That might be shocking to us. But I think we need to understand that the concerns that the writers of the Old Testament had were not so much about the afterlife. They were much more concerned about the life here and now. And so their writings reflected that. Their poetry and Psalms and Proverbs and these different places reflected the lived reality of the people, which was that life here mattered the most. How do we live now? How do we act now? How do we move out into this world as representatives of Israel's covenant God right here, right now in the promised land? How do we live out lives of obedience? This was the thing that really captured the mindset of the people in the Old Testament and the writers of the Old Testament texts. They're laying out this whole new way of interacting with the divine through this covenant life, where the divine cared more about the people than the people did the divine. The divine was in pursuit as opposed to the people being in pursuit. And so how does all of this play out? How does all of this live out in real life. That was the ultimate concern of the writers. And so the afterlife just kind of gets short shrift. Isaiah 14:9-11. It goes like this: says, "The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming." Now, this is the death of an emperor, right? Here in Isaiah 14:9, he's prophesying the death of the emperor. It says, the emperor, the king of Babylon. He says, "The realm of the dead are all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you. All those who were leaders in the world, it makes them rise from their thrones. All those who were kings over the nations, they all respond and they say to you, you also have become weak as we are. You have become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to the grave. Along with the noise of your harps, maggots are spread out beneath you and worms cover you." Now, surely there's some aspect of judgment here on the king of Babylon, but the bigger thing that we want to take note of is this idea of you've become weak as we are. You've become like us. There's nothing they can do. Those who are most powerful here on earth end up sharing the same fate of being completely powerless in the afterlife, because that is what happens when you die. And so we see this developed more so in another way in Job 7:7-14. He says, "Remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. My eyes will never see happiness again. The eye that now sees me will see me no longer. You will look for me, but I will be no more. As a cloud vanishes and is gone, so one who goes down to the grave does not return. He will never come to his house again. His place will know him no more. Therefore, I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the monster of the deep that you put me under guard? When I think my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, even then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me with visions." Now, later in Job, he says, "I know my Redeemer lives." So there's some hope within Job, but Job has no promise of life after death. Job has no promise of resurrection, right? I mean, he is very clear here that the one who goes to the grave does not return. There is no resurrection in the mind of Job, and this sets an interesting stage here, and it's one that we cannot overlook. And so up to this point, there just isn't a lot of hope in the Old Testament understanding, right? Is there any? Well, there is. First, let's just quick recap. Why was there little talk of the afterlife? Well, because the concern was here and now. What mattered was, how do we live today, not what is going to happen when we die. And then the second question that we need to ask, that we kind of want to wrestle with, especially those of us coming from the Christian perspective, is what role does love of God play? Right? This seems like pretty tough stuff from the Old Testament. There's no life after death. You die. But we understand God to be this God of love, right? We understand that God is the Redeemer God, the ransoming God, the reconciling God. We kind of look at this and say, what's happening here? And so as we walk through this, we need to we have to come to grips with that even the Old Testament writers were grappling with this. They were asking that question: how does this whole thing work? Well, we begin to get a sense of this in Genesis 1-3, right? What happens in Genesis 1-3? Well, we see that humanity was created for immortality. Now, there's an important distinction we need to make. Humanity was not created with immortality. It was created for immortality. The whole point of humanity being created was to spend eternity with God and to enjoy him forever. This This is why humanity was created in Genesis 1-3. Even the most skeptical reading of that, of those passages, can see that this was what God wanted for his human creation, was to spend eternity with them. So humanity is created for immortality. If that's the case, then why so little talk? What do we do? How do we get there? How do we gain immortality? Death, as we know it, seems to be alien in the opening of Genesis, right? In those first 3 chapters, there was, some people would say there was absolutely no death at all, but there was probably, vegetation and different things may have died in the garden. And what were Adam and Eve eating? They were probably eating vegetation, maybe some animal, probably not animals, but there was some death in that sense, but not in the death that we are talking about, not in this kind of death that we try to hide from, that we try to stop, that we try to fight off constantly, right? Not this death as a result of sin and shame. That kind of death comes later in Genesis 3, but not in the beginning. And so death is an alien concept. So, but the other thing we see in Genesis chapter 1-3 is that God is the giver of life. Therefore, God must set things right. Because what happens when Adam and Eve sin? What happens when they take and eat of that apple, when they give in to temptation? They die. God says, you are died. They are exiled from the garden, which is an exile towards death. So, but if God is the giver of life, then how does this work? Well, it works in that we immediately begin to see God at work, beginning to set things right. He is beginning this process of redemption and this hope and promise of redemption. And so he is going to set things right so that life wins out. Now, the exile of Adam was leading to death. Death was nothingness, right? This is kind of the idea we get throughout the Old Testament, that you die and that's it. It's just nothing. There is nothingness. Well, what does God do with nothingness? God creates out of nothingness. This is part of the beauty of this opening poem and this opening literature that we have in Genesis. We get caught up in all these scientific questions, and those aren't the questions that Genesis is asking. Genesis is asking this deeper question. Genesis is asking, why are we in the place that we are? Why does God interact with us the way God does? Why is humanity like it is? What is going on in the world? Well, what's going on in the world is that humanity was exiled. God, out of nothingness, is now creating something. He is making something new. He is bringing life. And ultimately, this is the heart of the covenant, which is where we're going to go next. Wright and Bird say it this way: the first big hint we get of life as Yahweh's purpose for humanity is the very structure of Israel's covenant. Moses held out to the people life and death, blessings and curses, and urged them to choose life, which meant, quite specifically, living in the promised land as opposed to being sent into the disgrace of exile. And this is important, right? This is what we see in Exodus and Deuteronomy and all these different places as Moses is laying this whole thing out. Life was deeply connected to the promised land. And so again, you can see why much of the Old Testament writers were so focused on writing about the promised land, because that is the connection to life. That living in the promised land was the hope of life. So the covenant, how does this work itself out? How does this bring life? Well, in Deuteronomy, it was promised that exile was not the final word to disobedience. And that repentance could bring about restoration and renewal of covenant in the hearts of the people. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 10. So one of the things that I love about Deuteronomy, one of the things I love about these books on the law, the Pentateuch, these first 5 books, is that they're not naive, right? The writers are not naive. They understand that people are Genesis 3 people. Yes, we're also Genesis 1 people. We're created in God's image. We were made in the beauty of the image of God, but we're also Genesis 3 people. It's a both and situation. We struggle, we fail, we fall to our temptations. And when we do, what happens? We go into exile. How do we get out of exile? Well, God brings us out of exile. And we do that, we receive that through repentance. And that's what restoration happens, restoration of the covenant and restoration of our hearts. And we see that built right into the center of the covenant. Now, this gets us into deliverance from Sheol, right? Because if we are exiled, and that exile leads to death, that exile leads us to Sheol, to the pit, to the darkness. So if God is going to be the one who is setting all things right, who is fixing this, who is undoing this, who is creating out of nothingness, then there must be a deliverance from Sheol. Do we see that at all in the Old Testament? Well, we do. And we're going to look at a few passages together. Psalm 16, 9 through 11. Therefore, my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Now, notice that there is nothing that the psalmist is doing. The psalmist is being rescued. The psalmist is being pulled out from the realm of the dead. The psalmist is being brought into the presence at the right hand of the divine. And the other thing that's interesting here is the reward, the pleasures that he receives is the being in the presence of God. This is where you see, this is where we begin to see this tie into the covenant, right? Because the heart of the covenant is this: I will be your God and you will be my people. And so if we're separate, if we break covenant, if we are moving into exile, we're not experiencing that I will be your God and you will be my people thing. And so God is making a way now to bridge that gulf, to bring people back into his presence for the experience of God being our God and us being God's people. Psalm 73, 21 through 26 says it this way: when my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless and ignorant. I was a brute beast before you. Yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterwards you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. You see, again, the psalmist is not doing anything to find his way or her way into the divine presence. It is God doing that. God pursuing them, God taking them into glory. And again, what is the inheritance? What is the portion that they receive? God is their portion. God is their inheritance, the presence, the eternal presence with the divine. And so you begin to see these cracks now happening. There is something going on in the Old Testament faith, right? This moving from this place of, when you die, you just die. You go to the pit, you go to Sheol. There's something going on here. There is something happening here. Again, it continues to develop. Psalm 73. They are like sheep and are destined to die. Death will be their shepherd, but the upright will prevail over them in the morning. Their forms will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. There is, again, now we are seeing this life after death. There is this hope of resurrection, this hope of something after death, to be in the presence of God. This is not some sort of spiritual thing, just some, disembodied. There is seems to be this sense of being fully present with the divine in these verses. And I don't know if you caught this in Psalm 73, but there is this reality between there's this reality to what's happening here in these resurrection conversations. You see what's happening is that people are wrestling with who God is out of his identity, this God of love, and they're living in this world that seems unfair, unjust, broken, and they're trying to make sense of this. How does this work? If our God is just and righteous and holy and loving, yet we live in a world that is unjust, unrighteous, unholy, why do the bad guys seem to win? And so there began to bubble up this idea, this hope that in the afterlife, the good guys win. The good guys are redeemed, they're ransomed, they're reconciled by God. They are brought into God's presence. And those who are bad, who are evil, are exiled and are cast out from God's presence. So the hope in these passages is not rooted in the immortality of the human soul, but it is rooted in the person and character of God. We cannot miss this. The Old Testament idea of people being delivered from Sheol is not because people are immortal and need to spend that time divine. No, that's not the deal. The deal is that God is a covenant God. God is faithful. God is loving. God is pursuing. God is reconciling. God is ransoming. God is redeeming. Who God is means that he is going to be faithful to his covenant to the very end. And because of who God is at work trying to make sure, God is at work making sure that his covenant is fulfilled, so that God's people will be God's people, and we will be his God. We'll be with him in forever. Wright and Bird say it this way. They say, when this strong faith in Yahweh as the creator, the life giver, the God of ultimate justice, met the apparent contradiction of the injustices and sufferings of life, there was at that point, as we have seen, a chance of fresh belief springing up. Thus, if Yahweh was the inheritance of his people, and if his love and faithfulness were as strong as Israel's traditions made out, then there was no ultimate bar in seeing death itself as a beaten foe. Okay, that's a huge long run-on sentence. Well, the first sentence is, both of them are long run sentences. But it's pretty beautiful to think about it this way, right? If Yahweh was the inheritance of his people, and if his love and faithfulness were as strong as Israel's traditions made out, then there was no ultimate bar to seeing death itself as a beaten foe. You see, they can make the transition from death being nothing to death being conquered, not because of some sort of desire for that, not because they're trying to be new, trying to create some new way of thinking about the divine. No, they got there because of who they understood God to be. Do you see the God-centeredness of this whole conversation about resurrection? It's not about us. It is centered in the very being and person of who God is. And it's just that's the key thing here. So death is a beaten foe. It becomes beaten. Ezekiel 37, right? This is the dry bones passage, arguably the most famous resurrection passage in the Old Testament. And so what happens there? Well, God promises to open the graves of Israel and bring up the dead. God here is talking about bringing life back to the dead. The graves would be open and people would bodily resurrect. This idea here is clearly a resurrection concept. We see this most fully developed there in Ezekiel 37, but it doesn't stop there. This theme of God opening the graves and redeeming people and resurrecting people and bringing people to new life runs through the prophets, which makes sense, right? Because if we see this, we see this progressive revelation of, well, there's death. We go to Sheol, we go to the pit. But then as we understand more deeply about who God is in his love and his grace and in the person of who God is, well, we know God is going to be faithful to the covenant, and God is going to be at work trying to make sure that the covenant is fulfilled. So now there's this hope. And now in the later writings, in the writings of these prophets, what happens? They say, death is a beaten foe. Resurrection is a real option. Resurrection is what God is at work doing. The earliest writings of the prophets, one of the earliest ones is Hosea. And he writes in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence." You see, Hosea is tapping into this idea of resurrection. This is a resurrection passage. On the third day, he will restore us that we may live in his presence. The New Testament writers grab hold of all of this, right? When it comes to thinking about Jesus, and Jesus grabs hold of this idea of the third day being restored. And so this is resurrection. In Hosea 13, 14 through 15 says, "I will deliver this people from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. Where, O death, are your plagues? Where, O grave, is your destruction? I will have no compassion, even though he thrives among his brothers. An east wind from the Lord will come, blowing in from the desert. His spring will fail, and his well dry up. His storehouse will be plundered, all of its treasures." I mean, this passage here in Hosea 13, 14 through 15 gets grabbed onto tightly by the New Testament writers. Paul directly quotes, where, O death, are your plagues? Where, O grave, is your destruction? Right? I mean, he quotes this in 1 Corinthians 15. This is one where again, the coming back from death to life, coming out of the grave to be present with God. It's right there. This is being developed. Isaiah chapter 26, it gets even more clear. It gets even more specific. It says, "But your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead." This is resurrection. This is bodily resurrection. We now see here developed in one of its most clearest forms in the Old Testament, the idea of a bodily resurrection. This is why the Pharisees believed in bodily resurrection, partially because of what we see here in Isaiah 26:19. These are ideas that were being embraced by Qumran, by the Pharisees, by other sects within in Judaism. So this idea of bodily resurrection was not a foreign concept. This is not an invented idea in the first century by early Christians. This idea is clearly, this idea of bodily resurrection is rooted here in Isaiah 26:19. And it is rooted here, again, out of the identity of who God is and his character. And then we get to Daniel. And in Daniel, it says, "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So we're talking about multitudes here. This is not some limited thing. This is not just a handful of Jewish people. In Daniel's mind now, we're looking at a global phenomenon. We're looking at this broader thing. He is inclusive. He is expansive. Something is going on where God is at work, raising people to life. And remember, life in the Old Testament, this is not disembodied spirits. Life is real living, real presence with God. And as we saw there in Isaiah 26, bodily resurrection. So I want to read as we begin to wrap this thing up. While the explicit belief in resurrection was late developing in the Old Testament, it's developed, it's there, and it fits with our understanding of how God reveals, of this idea of progressive revelation. But I want to read this last bit to kind of wrap us up with out of Reitenberg's text, and they say it so well. They say the constant factor throughout the types of belief we have surveyed is Israel's God himself. The vision of Yahweh's creation and covenant, his promises, his faithfulness to them, his purposes for Israel, not least his gift of the land, his power over all opposing forces, including finally death itself, his love for the world, for his human creatures, for Israel in particular, and especially for those who served him and followed in his way, his justice, because of which evil would eventually be condemned and righteousness upheld. This vision of the creator and covenant God underlies the ancient belief in the national and territorial hope, the emerging belief that the relationship with Yahweh would be unbreakable, even by death, and the eventual belief that Yahweh would raise the dead. This is what we begin to see developed in the Old Testament. This is the scriptural basis for what the New Testament writers and how the New Testament writers, develop their ideas and concepts of resurrection, of bodily resurrection. It's rooted in the Old Testament scriptures, but more so, it's rooted in the character and identity of the God whom they worship, who they found, who in their opinions and who in their thought and in what we believe, it was ultimately revealed in the life and the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So that was a lot of information, a lot of stuff dumped there on you guys. And just threw a ton of info at you. So do you have any questions? Is there anything floating around in your head as we did that pretty fast survey of the Old Testament on looking at resurrection?
In the section when you were talking about deliverance from Sheol,
yeah,
and you read the passage on Job where he's saying, kind of like when you're dead, you're dead.
Yeah.
But then he also says, the worms destroy my body, yet in my flesh will I see God. So it sounds like he believed that there was some kind of life after death.
He had some sense, some hope for it, right? But as you continue to read, like there's no certainty. And that's I think that's the bigger idea here, that there's no certainty in what he's getting at. Because when we as we kind of wrestle through this, as we think about how these guys were trying to understand things, Job hoped. he hoped that God would do something, that there would be this redemptive element in what God was going to do, because God, again, rooted in the character of God, that God was just and righteous. But in the midst of his hope for that, there was still this sense of, yeah, I'm still going to die though. Like this, and I don't have a certainty of what is going to happen, which is very much in contrast to what we see developed like in that Isaiah 26 passage, right? About what God will do. There develops a certainty in God redeeming and resurrecting the righteous. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So then one other question, you've used the word Sheol a lot. Is Sheol the same thing as Hades? Because last week Hades was mentioned quite a bit. Are they the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's similar concepts, right? They're the place of the dead. Now Hades being fleshed out by the Greeks and Romans is very different than Sheol as understood in the Old Testament, right? In the Old Testament, there is no god called Hades, right? Because that's where Hades gets its name, is from the Greek god Hades, who is the overseer of the place of death. We don't have that in the Old Testament. There's just God. And so Sheol, the pit, the darkness, these are all interchangeable concepts in the Old Testament for the place of the dead. So I think they probably understood them similarly to the Greeks, in the sense that they're just kind of phantoms, shades. They're just kind of sort of existing in this place of the dead. So in that sense, they're the same. But as you dive into maybe some of the particulars, they get a little bit different, just because we're talking here now about the Jewish, the Old Testament understanding of what happens after you die, as opposed to the Greek understanding of what happens when you die.
Okay.
Anything else?
Not for me.
All right. Well, then we'll put some wraps on this thing. So we will be back again next Thursday at 1:00 in the afternoon. And if you would like to be a part of the live recording of Beyond Sunday School, then hit me up on any social media that you're connected with me on, and I will get you the link, and you can be a part of the Zoom room and be a part of the conversation, ask questions, even interrupt me. And so we will be back next week. You can find this on Beyond Sunday School anywhere you find your podcasts. You can find me on YouTube, youtube.com/Daniel Rose. You can hook us up, check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and just do a search for Beyond Sunday School, and you will find everything. So thanks again for being with us, and until next time,